The screaming dive of a Japanese Zero fighter pierced the humid air above Henderson Field. As Marine Private First Class John Barcelone dove into his foxhole, the earth erupting in fountains of coral and dirt around him. It was October 25, 1942, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance on this forgotten speck of jungle. Called Guadalcanal, 6 months earlier, the Japanese Empire had seemed unstoppable. After Pearl Harbor, their forces had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, consuming Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. But now, on this steaming tropical island in the Solomon Chain, American Marines were making their first major stand against the rising sun. The campaign had begun on August 7, 1942, when 16,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Red Beach. Their mission was audacious in its simplicity: capture the nearly completed Japanese airfield and deny the enemy a forward base that could threaten the Allied supply lines to Australia. What they found instead was the beginning of a 6-month nightmare that would earn Guadalcanal the grim nickname the Island of Death. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marine forces, had initially faced light resistance from the surprised Japanese construction workers and naval troops. The airfield, hastily abandoned by its builders, fell into American hands within 48 hours. The Marines rechristened it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a dive bomber pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. But the Japanese High Command, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had no intention of allowing this strategic prize to remain in American hands. Within days of the landing, the Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness, began delivering reinforcements and supplies to Japanese forces gathering in the jungle. Beyond the Marine perimeter, the first major Japanese counterattack came on August 21st, when Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 900 crack troops of the 28th Infantry Regiment in a frontal assault across the Ilu River. Ichiki, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Russo-Japanese border incidents, was supremely confident. The enemy on Guadalcanal is not more than 2,000 men. He had radioed Tokyo. We will crush them in one blow. Historical accounts from the U.S. Marine Corps' Historical Division confirm Ichiki's fatal underestimation of American strength and resolve. The reality was far different. Marine machine gunners, positioned in coconut log bunkers along the riverbank, cut down wave after wave of charging Japanese soldiers. By dawn, the Ilu ran red with blood, and Colonel Ichiki, rather than face the shame of defeat, committed ritual suicide on the beach. Of his 900 men, only a handful survived to stumble back into the jungle. This first victory gave the Marines hope, but it also marked the beginning of an escalating cycle of violence. Each failed Japanese attack brought larger follow-up assaults, while American reinforcements trickled in aboard ships that had to dodge submarine attacks and air raids to reach the island. The stage was set for a battle that would determine whether American forces could transition from defense to offense in the Pacific, or whether Japan's empire would continue its relentless expansion toward Australia and beyond. The tropical night of August 8th to 9th, 1942, brought with it a naval disaster that would haunt the U.S. Navy for months to come. As the Marines on Guadalcanal settled into their captured airfield, completely unaware of the carnage unfolding in the waters nearby, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force was methodically destroying the Allied naval screen that protected their lifeline to the outside world. Admiral Mikawa, flying his flag aboard the heavy cruiser Chikai, had assembled a formidable strike force: 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer. His plan was elegantly simple: strike hard and fast at the Allied cruisers protecting the transport ships, then withdraw before American air power could respond at dawn. What followed would become known as the Battle of Savo Island, one of the most crushing defeats in U.S. Navy history. The Allied force, under the tactical command of British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, was divided into 3 groups patrolling the approaches to the landing beaches. The northern group, consisting of the heavy cruisers Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, along with 2 destroyers, held the passage between Savo Island and Florida Island. The southern group, with the Australian cruiser Canberra and American cruiser Chicago, guarded the passage between Savo Island and Guadalcanal itself. At 1:38 in the morning, Japanese lookouts spotted the destroyer Blue on patrol. Mikawa's ships, approaching in a single column at high speed, had achieved complete tactical surprise. The first Allied vessel to detect the Japanese was the destroyer Patterson, whose radio operator managed to broadcast a warning, "Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor," before Japanese shells began raining down on the Allied formation. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of night fighting tactics by the Japanese, who had trained extensively for such encounters, using superior optical equipment and well-rehearsed battle drills. Mikawa's ships systematically destroyed their opponents. The Canberra, hit by torpedoes and shells, was knocked out of action within minutes. The Chicago, her bow blown off by a torpedo, limped away from the fight. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive naval history, The Two-Ocean War, the Japanese achieved this victory through superior night fighting training and equipment. In the Northern Passage, the carnage was even worse. The Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were caught completely off guard, their crews many still at general quarters, but unprepared for the violence that erupted around them. Japanese 8-inch shells, fired at point-blank range, turned the American cruisers into floating infernos. Captain Frederick Reefcole of the Vincennes, awakened by the sounds of battle, initially thought the ships firing were American vessels engaging a Japanese submarine. The Quincy took a direct hit on her bridge, killing or wounding most of her senior officers. Captain Samuel Moore, mortally wounded, ordered his guns to return fire. But the ship was already doomed. Within 30 minutes of the first shots being fired, she rolled over and sank, taking 139 men with her to the bottom. The Vincennes fought on for nearly an hour, her guns scoring several hits on Japanese ships, but the outcome was never in doubt. Burning from stem to stern, she too joined her sisters on the floor of what would soon be called Iron Bottom Sound, along with 332 of her crew. Admiral Mikawa, having achieved a stunning tactical victory, made the controversial decision to withdraw rather than pressing his attack against the vulnerable transport ships. His cruisers had expended most of their ammunition and fuel, and daylight would bring American air attacks from Henderson Field and distant carriers. The decision to withdraw may have cost Japan the campaign, as the destruction of the American transports would have left the Marines without supplies and reinforcements. As dawn broke over the blood-stained waters, the full scope of the disaster became clear. For Allied cruisers lay on the bottom, over 1,000 sailors were dead or missing, and the Japanese had suffered only minor damage to 3 ships. The Marines on Guadalcanal were now truly isolated, their naval protection shattered and their supply line severed. The real test of American resolve was about to begin. The morning of August 20th, 1942, brought the roar of aircraft engines to the jungle clearing that had become Henderson Field. Major John Smith leading a squadron of Grumman Wildcat fighters touched down on the hastily repaired airstrip as Marines cheered from their foxholes. After nearly 2 weeks of isolation following the naval disaster at Savo Island, American air power had finally arrived on Guadalcanal. These first aircraft, 19 Wildcats and 12 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, represented far more than their modest numbers suggested. They were the foundation of what would become known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the island's code designation. Operating from a primitive airfield carved from a coconut plantation, these pilots would face overwhelming odds in daily battles that would determine the fate of the campaign. Captain Marion Carl, already an ace with 5 confirmed kills, quickly established himself as one of Henderson Field's most aggressive pilots, flying his Wildcat in daily missions against Japanese bombers and fighters. Carl embodied the desperate courage that characterized the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. "We knew we were outnumbered and outgunned," Carl would later recall, "but we also knew that if Henderson Field fell, the Marines on the ground would be wiped out." The Japanese response to the arrival of American aircraft was swift and merciless. Admiral Yamamoto ordered daily bombing raids by twin-engine Betty bombers. escorted by the deadly Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. These raids, arriving with clockwork precision around noon each day, became known to the defenders as the noon balloon, a sardonic reference to the predictable timing of the attacks. The Zeros presented a particular challenge to American pilots, faster and more maneuverable than the stubby Wildcats. They had been flown by experienced pilots who had honed their skills in the skies over China and the Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, leading many of these escort missions, was typical of the caliber of Japanese aviator the Americans faced, a veteran. With over 3,000 flight hours and 12 confirmed victories, war correspondent Richard Trigaskis, in his acclaimed book Guadalcanal Diary, documented the daily struggle of both pilots and ground crews under constant enemy attack. Ground crews worked around the clock to keep the American aircraft operational, often repairing battle damage while Japanese shells fell nearby. Aviation machinists mate first-class Paul Mason, working on a damaged Dauntless, was killed by shrapnel while installing a new engine. Such losses were not uncommon, as the Japanese had positioned artillery in the hills overlooking the airfield, subjecting it to regular bombardment. The primitive conditions at Henderson Field would have been challenging enough without enemy action. The airstrip itself was made of pierced steel planking laid over compressed coral, which created clouds of choking dust when aircraft took off or landed. During the frequent tropical rainstorms, the field became a muddy quagmire that trapped aircraft and made operations nearly impossible. Fuel was critically short, often arriving aboard submarines or fast destroyer runs that could evade Japanese naval patrols. Aviation gasoline was so precious that pilots sometimes siphoned fuel from damaged aircraft to keep others operational. Ammunition was equally scarce, with pilots limited to brief bursts of fire in aerial combat. Despite these hardships, the Cactus Air Force began to exact a toll on Japanese air power. Major Smith, leading by example, shot down 19 Japanese aircraft during his tour on Guadalcanal. The innovative tactics developed by American pilots, using the Wildcat's superior diving speed and rugged construction to offset the Zeros' advantages in climb and maneuverability, gradually began to level the playing field. The most significant victory came on August 24th, when Dauntless dive bombers from Henderson Field joined carrier aircraft in attacking the Japanese carrier Ryuyo during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The successful coordination between land-based and carrier aviation marked a turning point in American tactical development, though the struggle for air superiority over Guadalcanal was far from over. By late August, both sides recognized that control of Henderson Field had become the key to the entire campaign. The Japanese began planning a major ground offensive to capture the airstrip, while American reinforcements prepared to defend it. The stage was set for a series of increasingly desperate battles that would test the resolve of both sides to their absolute limits. The darkness of the tropical night provided cover for one of the most audacious supply operations of the Pacific War. As American Marines huddled in their foxholes around Henderson Field, Japanese destroyers raced down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, at speeds exceeding 30 knots. This was the Tokyo Express, and it would become the lifeline that kept Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fighting against overwhelming odds. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, the mastermind behind these high-speed nocturnal runs, had transformed what should have been a routine supply mission into an art form of naval warfare. His destroyers, stripped of some armament to carry troops and supplies, would arrive off Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, unload their precious cargo in floating drums, and race back up the slot before dawn brought American air attacks from Henderson Field. The Americans quickly dubbed these night visitors the Tokyo Express, though the Japanese knew them by the more prosaic designation of Rat Run. To the Marines on the ground, listening to the rumble of distant engines and the splash of supplies being dumped overboard, these nocturnal visitations represented enemy reinforcement and resupply that threatened to tip the balance of the campaign. Admiral Tanaka's first major success came on the night of August 18th to 19th, 1942, when his destroyers delivered over 900 troops of the Ichiki detachment. The precision of the operation was remarkable. The ships arrived exactly on schedule, unloaded their human cargo in less than an hour, and departed without detection by American naval forces. The destroyers themselves were marvels of Japanese naval engineering. Ships like the Kajero, Arashi, and Hamikaze could sustain speeds of 35 knots while carrying significant military cargo. Their crews, trained in night operations and equipped with superior optical equipment, could navigate the treacherous waters around Guadalcanal with remarkable precision. Lieutenant Commander Kiyoshi Kinashi, captain of the destroyer Ayanami, became legendary among his crews for his ability to deliver supplies exactly where and when they were needed. The Americans control the daylight hours, Kinashi told his officers, but the night belongs to us. His confidence was not misplaced during the first month of Tokyo Express operations. Not a single Japanese destroyer was lost to American action. Naval historian Paul Dull, in his comprehensive study, A Battle History of the Imperial Japanese Navy, details the sophisticated logistics network that supported these operations. The supplies delivered by the Tokyo Express were as varied as they were vital. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, and communication equipment all made the journey down the slot. Perhaps most importantly, the destroyers brought fresh troops to replace the mounting casualties suffered in repeated attacks against the Marine perimeter. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived aboard the destroyer Yumikaze on August 29th, along with advance elements of his 35th Brigade. Kawaguchi, a veteran of fighting in China and Java, brought with him plans for a coordinated assault that would finally drive the Americans from Henderson Field. The supply drops themselves were ingenious in their simplicity. Japanese engineers had developed waterproof drums that could be thrown overboard and would float to designated beaches, where waiting troops would recover them. When direct beach landings were too dangerous, the destroyers would dump their cargo in shallow water, marking the location with small floats that could be recovered by submarines or small craft. American efforts to intercept the Tokyo Express met with limited success during the early months of the campaign. The few patrol torpedo boats available were no match for heavily armed destroyers, and American cruisers and destroyers were either unavailable or positioned too far away to respond effectively. The psychological impact of the Tokyo Express runs was perhaps as significant as their material contribution. Every night, Marine sentries could hear the distant rumble of engines and the splash of supplies being delivered to their enemies. The knowledge that the Japanese were being reinforced and resupplied while American supply lines remained tenuous added to the stress of an already desperate situation. However, the Tokyo Express came with significant costs for the Japanese. The high-speed runs consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and the wear on engines and hulls was severe. More critically, the destroyers used in supply runs were unavailable for their primary mission of anti-submarine warfare and fleet escort duties. By late September, American air power was beginning to exact a toll on the Tokyo Express. Dauntless dive bombers from Henderson Field, flying night missions guided by radar, scored their first hits on Japanese destroyers. The era of unchallenged Japanese dominance over the night waters around Guadalcanal was drawing to a close, but not before Tanaka's ships had delivered the reinforcements that would make the coming ground battles some of the most savage of the Pacific War. The pre-dawn darkness of September 13th, 1942, erupted in a cacophony of screaming Japanese soldiers, chattering machine guns, and exploding grenades as Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi launched his most ambitious assault against the American perimeter. The target was a low coral ridge south of Henderson Field, defended by Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion and paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Battalion. By morning, this unnamed piece of ground would earn the grim designation Bloody Ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the combined force of raiders and paratroopers, had positioned his men along the ridge after reconnaissance patrols reported massive Japanese troop movements in the jungle. Edson, a veteran of operations in Nicaragua and a Medal of Honor recipient, understood that his 800 men were all that stood between Henderson Field and disaster. The Japanese plan was ambitious in scope and complex in execution. Kawaguchi had divided his force into 3 columns, with the main effort directed against Edson's Ridge, while secondary attacks would strike the Marine positions along the Ilu River and near Kukum. The coordination required for such a multi-pronged assault in dense jungle, without adequate communications, was beyond the capabilities of any military force in 1942. The first Japanese probe came at 9:30 on the evening of September 12th, when elements of the 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry Regiment, attempted to infiltrate the Marine positions. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islander serving as a scout for the Americans, had been captured by the Japanese earlier that day and brutally tortured for information about American positions. Despite being bayoneted multiple times, Vuza escaped and crawled back to Marine lines with vital intelligence about the coming attack. The main assault began at midnight, with a barrage from Japanese mountain guns and mortars, followed by waves of infantry charging up the slopes of the ridge. The Japanese battle cry of Banzai Marine, You Die, echoed through the jungle as soldiers of the Kawaguchi detachment threw themselves against Marine positions with suicidal fury. Private First Class Joseph Champagne, manning a machine gun position near the crest of the ridge, watched in fascination and horror as Japanese soldiers continued to advance despite devastating casualties. They just kept coming. Champagne later recalled, You'd cut down a whole wave, and another would take its place. I'd never seen anything like it. Robert Leckey's memoir Helmet for My Pillow provides a first-hand account of the desperate fighting on Bloody Ridge from a Marine rifleman's perspective. The critical moment came around in the morning when Japanese troops succeeded in breaking through the Marine line at several points. Colonel Edson, calmly smoking his pipe despite enemy fire, personally reorganized the defense and led counterattacks that restored the position. His famous words to his men, The enemy is on our front, behind us, and on our flanks. They can't get away this time, became legendary in Marine Corps history. The fighting reached its climax when Japanese soldiers penetrated to within yards of Henderson Field itself. The airstrip's operations tent was hit by mortar fire, and pilots sleeping in their aircraft could hear enemy voices in the darkness nearby. Major Richard Mangrum, commanding a squadron of dive bombers, armed his pilots with rifles and organized them into a defensive line. As dawn broke on September 14th, the full extent of the carnage became visible. The slopes of the ridge were carpeted with Japanese dead, many hanging grotesquely from the barbed wire that the Marines had strung during the preceding days. American casualties were also severe. Of Edson's original 800 men, fewer than 300 remained effective for duty. General Kawaguchi, his force shattered and his communications with subordinate units severed, ordered a withdrawal into the jungle of the 6,000 Japanese troops who had participated in the assault. Fewer than 2,000 remained capable of combat. The failure of the September offensive marked a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign, though neither side fully understood its significance at the time. The defense of Bloody Ridge had cost both sides dearly, but it had achieved something more important than tactical victory. The successful defense proved that American forces could stand against determined Japanese assault, while the heavy casualties inflicted on Kawaguchi's force significantly reduced Japanese combat capability on the island. For the Marines, the battle became a source of enormous pride and confidence. They had faced the best that Japan could throw at them and emerged victorious. The ridge itself was renamed Edson's Ridge, in honor of the commander whose leadership had been instrumental in the victory. However, the respite was temporary. Japanese reinforcements continued to arrive via the Tokyo Express, and both sides prepared for even larger battles to come. The fight for Guadalcanal had reached a new level of intensity, and the ultimate outcome remained very much in doubt. The moonless night of November 12th to 13th, 1942, brought with it a naval battle that would determine the fate of Guadalcanal and potentially the entire Pacific War, as Japanese battleships approached Henderson Field with the intention of bombarding the airstrip into rubble. American cruisers and destroyers raced northward to intercept them, in what would become one of the most savage surface actions in naval history. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, flying his flag aboard the heavy cruiser San Francisco, commanded a hastily assembled force of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. His opponent, Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, brought 2 battleships, the mighty Hiei and Kirishima, along with 1 light cruiser and 14 destroyers. The Japanese plan was straightforward: use the battleship's massive 14-inch guns to destroy Henderson Field once and for all, clearing the way for a major convoy carrying reinforcements for another ground assault. The American force was outnumbered and outgunned, but Callahan was determined to prevent the bombardment at any cost. His ships had been assembled from various task forces, and many of his captains had never worked together before. Communications were poor, radar contacts were confusing, and the tactical situation was chaotic. Yet Callahan pressed forward into the narrow waters north of Guadalcanal, knowing that failure would doom the Marine garrison. The battle began at 1:48 in the morning, when the destroyer Cushing spotted Japanese ships ahead. What followed was a confused melee fought at point-blank range in complete darkness, with ships from both sides firing at targets that were often friendly vessels. The narrow waters off Guadalcanal became a hellish cauldron of exploding shells, burning ships, and desperate men. Lieutenant Commander Edward Parker, commanding the destroyer Laffey, found his ship surrounded by Japanese vessels. With remarkable courage, Parker maneuvered his small destroyer to within 20 yards of the battleship Hiei and opened fire with all guns. The Laffey's 5-inch shells, fired at such close range they could hardly miss, raked the battleship's superstructure and knocked out several secondary gun mounts. Before Japanese return fire reduced the destroyer to a sinking wreck, the heavy cruiser Atlanta, caught in a crossfire between Japanese ships, was hit by over 50 shells and numerous torpedoes. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, embarked aboard Atlanta as a passenger, was killed along with most of the ship's senior officers. The cruiser, her hull riddled with holes and her superstructure a twisted mass of steel, managed to limp away from the battle but would sink the following day. Historian James Hornfisher, in his definitive account Neptune's Inferno, describes this as the most chaotic and violent naval battle of the war. Admiral Callaghan's flagship San Francisco engaged in a gun duel with the battleship Kirishima, at ranges so close that the ship's secondary batteries were firing into each other's bridges. Callahan himself was killed when a Japanese shell hit the cruiser's bridge, but not before he had coordinated an attack that left both Japanese battleships damaged and their mission compromised. The destroyer Barton took a torpedo hit that broke her in half, sinking in less than 3 minutes with heavy loss of life. The destroyer Cushing, her steering disabled by shell hits, circled helplessly while Japanese destroyers poured fire into her hull. Captain Thomas Ryan, commanding the destroyer, ordered his men to abandon ship as fires reached the ammunition magazines. Perhaps the most heroic action of the night belonged to the destroyer O'Bannon, commanded by Commander Edwin Wilkinson. Finding his ship alone among several Japanese destroyers, Wilkinson maneuvered with such skill that the enemy vessels, firing in the darkness, hit each other instead of his ship. The O'Bannon escaped with minor damage while contributing to the sinking of the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki. The battleship Hiei, damaged by numerous shell hits from American cruisers and destroyers, began to fall behind the Japanese formation, her steering gear damaged and fires burning throughout her superstructure. The massive ship became vulnerable to air attack at daybreak. Dive bombers from Henderson Field and torpedo planes from the carrier Enterprise would finish what the American surface ships had started, sending the Hiei to the bottom. The first Japanese battleship lost in the war. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, both fleets were scattered and bloodied. The Americans had lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with most of their remaining ships damaged. But they had accomplished their mission. The Japanese bombardment force had been turned back, and Henderson Field remained operational. The Japanese losses were equally severe, with the battleship Hiei doomed and several destroyers sunk or heavily damaged. More importantly, The failure to destroy Henderson Field meant that Japanese reinforcement convoys would continue to face devastating air attacks during daylight hours. The First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal had been a tactical draw, but a strategic victory for the Americans. The Japanese would try again 2 nights later with equally disastrous results, marking the beginning of the end for their presence on Guadalcanal. The dawn of February 9, 1943, brought an unusual silence to the beaches of Guadalcanal. For the first time in 6 months, no Japanese artillery shells whistled overhead, no enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon, and no Tokyo Express destroyers rumbled down the slot under cover of darkness. The reason for this unprecedented quiet would not become clear to American forces until patrol boats discovered abandoned Japanese positions and hastily constructed evacuation craft hidden in jungle coves. Operation K. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal had succeeded beyond American comprehension. Under cover of what appeared to be routine Tokyo Express runs, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had orchestrated the withdrawal of over 10,000 Japanese troops. In a series of brilliantly executed nighttime operations, the soldiers who had fought so tenaciously for 6 months were gone, leaving behind only empty bunkers and the detritus of a lost campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, leading a patrol of Marine raiders into formerly contested territory, could hardly believe what he was seeing. Positions that had cost hundreds of American lives to approach were now deserted, their elaborate defensive works intact but unmanned. It was like walking through a ghost town. Carlson would later write, "The enemy had simply vanished into thin air." The Japanese decision to evacuate had not come easily. Emperor Hirohito himself had been reluctant to abandon Japanese forces on the island, viewing withdrawal as tantamount to admitting defeat. However, the combined pressure of Admiral Yamamoto and General Sugiyama finally convinced the emperor that continued resistance on Guadalcanal would only result in the meaningless destruction of irreplaceable veteran troops. The evacuation had been a masterpiece of military logistics executed under the most difficult circumstances. Fast destroyers and submarines, arriving under cover of darkness and adverse weather, had removed entire units while maintaining the illusion of continued resistance. Through carefully planned deception operations, artillery continued to fire on American positions using pre-positioned ammunition stores, while radio transmissions maintained the fiction of active units long after their evacuation. Captain Yasuhiro Suzuki, one of the last Japanese officers evacuated from the island, later described the operation as both a military success and a personal tragedy. "We had left so many of our comrades buried in that accursed jungle," Suzuki recalled. "To abandon their graves felt like a betrayal of everything we had fought for." Military historian Frank O. Huff, in his official Marine Corps history, The Island War, documents the methodical American advance into abandoned Japanese territory. The American discovery of the evacuation came gradually, as patrols advancing into previously contested areas found position after position deserted. Major General Alexander Patch, who had replaced the exhausted Vandegrift as commander of ground forces, initially suspected a trap. Japanese forces had demonstrated their tactical cunning too many times for the Americans to believe. They had simply given up, however, as the evidence mounted. It became clear that organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal had ended. The few remaining enemy soldiers were stragglers and wounded men left behind in the evacuation, posing no significant military threat. After 6 months of brutal fighting, the Americans had finally achieved undisputed control of the island. The cost of victory had been enormous for both sides. American casualties totaled over 7,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese losses were estimated at over 24,000 dead. The naval battles around the island had turned the waters of Iron Bottom Sound into a graveyard for dozens of warships from both nations. Yet the significance of Guadalcanal extended far beyond casualty figures or territorial control. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces had defeated the Japanese in a sustained campaign, proving that the supposedly invincible enemy could be beaten. The psychological impact of this victory resonated throughout the Pacific. giving Allied forces the confidence to launch increasingly ambitious offensive operations. The campaign had also revealed crucial lessons about amphibious warfare, close air support, and joint operations that would prove invaluable in future battles. The innovative tactics developed by the Cactus Air Force, the coordination between naval and ground forces, and the integration of intelligence from coast watchers all became standard practice for subsequent Pacific operations. Perhaps most importantly, Guadalcanal marked the point where American industrial capacity began to tip the balance of the war, decisively in favor of the Allies. The ships, aircraft, and equipment that had seemed so scarce during the early months of the campaign were now flowing from American factories in unprecedented quantities. As the last Japanese survivors disappeared into the jungles of other islands, and American engineers began expanding Henderson Field into a major airbase, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had irreversibly shifted. The long road to Tokyo had begun on the beaches of Guadalcanal, where a few thousand Marines had held their ground against overwhelming odds and changed the course of history. The island fight that had begun as a desperate gamble to halt Japanese expansion had become the turning point of the Pacific War, proving that American resolve, properly supported and skillfully led, could overcome any enemy. The lesson would not be lost on military planners in Washington, who were already drawing up plans for the next phase of the long march across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands.